Hello, strangers. Happy Tuesday. I've got another story for you. This one is a trip. This is story number 3. I went to a private school from kindergarten through 12th grade. The classes were about 30 to 40 kids. Because of the small class sizes, we had a lot more events and get-togethers than I've ever heard from my friends in public school. Things like a few camping trips, some road trips, anything you could think of except, of course, dances. Private school, remember. I heard this story from a teacher while we were at a lock-in. If you've never done a lock-in, it's where a group sets up sleeping bags, tents, cots, whatever in like a large auditorium or a gym. There's usually a movie on a projector. It's usually G-rated too. There were always sing-alongs. The idea is large group sleepover outside of one person's home. They split the kids into boys and girls for sleeping arrangements, but even then you're still asking a couple of teachers to wrangle 15 to 20 kids. Hence, they lock the doors, so you and your friends are locked in and can't wander off and vandalize a bathroom or whatever. We had gathered around a fake campfire. Fake because indoors, but they did their best. Though our school was kind of strict about magic and stuff, Harry Potter and Wizard of Oz were both banned. One of the teachers, Mr. Pruitt, suggested we tell some spooky stories. No one said a word. We waited with bated breath. Was this a test? It could have been. It was a little too good to be true. Would we, by being too excited, fall short of the glory of their school? But it was not a test. One of the quieter teachers I hadn't had yet, a pretty but eternally puckered Mrs. Dunnig, spoke up, saying she'd go first. Miss Dunnig began in her teacher voice, telling us that her grandfather was really respected. She said he was a very stately gentleman, well respected for his business practices and community-minded altruism. When he died, his funeral was standing room only. Mrs. Dunnig seemed very proud of that. When he passed, Mrs. Dunnig's mom, his daughter, was willed several priceless heirlooms and a sizable stake in the family trust. He passed when Miss Dunnig was about our age, so she didn't really understand what that was. But she understood the boxes. She said they smelled of age and old book glue. She was really excited to look through all of these long-forgotten family treasures from the attic and various cubbies around his house. She told us she spent hours going through them. Family albums and fine Irish linens and silver still shiny under its tarnish. But in the boxes, she also found some plates. Plates that felt like eggshells, thin and fragile and likely very expensive. The markings on them were symbols she had never seen. 2-headed eagles and trees and anchors, all framed in Latin. They were, as her mother told her, and here her voice is pitched lowered, conspiratorial, like a 10-year-old sharing a secret. Masonic. I had been gearing up for the worst. I mean, when somebody says Grandpa's old plates with eagles, the implication tends to be less frights, more Reich. But I didn't know what to think of what she said they were from. Masonic, like Freemasons. I knew a little bit, like Masons having something to do with the all-seeing eye and pyramid on the back of the dollar bill. That and the unremarkable lodge out by the industrial area of town, dull brown and unassuming amidst the Quonset huts and lumber yards. But aside from that, I didn't know why she was grasping her pearls about it. I wasn't alone. The other kids were looking around too, not grasping why this was to be such a big deal. But Mrs. Dunnig went on to explain that, from her understanding, the Freemasons were a secretive society that raised many eyebrows in the Christian community for their embracing of mysticism and ritual and their apparent love of symbols that bordered on the occult. This was a big red-letter term for us, the occult. Whenever a teacher at our school mentioned the occult, or its somewhat tamer but still suspect little brother, secular, the kids understood that this was bad and wrong, and to even examine it beyond this second-grade verbiage would be sinning. No, big, bad, and wrong things were to be placed on a high shelf and locked away, because even the thought of them was dangerous. Which is why at this point I was feverishly taking mental notes to go look up Masons when I got home. Mrs. Dunnig continued, telling us that her family was at a loss. On the one hand, Masonic symbols and artifacts flew in the face of their religion and caused deep unease, as though the compass and square were a tarted-up pentagram and the plates stained in the spatter of candle wax from demonic rites. On the other hand, so deep was the respect and regard for the late John Dunnig that to throw away or sell some of his treasured belongings seemed equally sacrilegious. Her father explained it like a Christmas carol, with Ebenezer's maids and butlers chunnering over what they'd managed to steal from a dead man's house to sell. The thought of getting rid of Grandpa John Dunnig's things seemed worse than harboring Masonic artifacts. It was the ultimate sin of being tacky. Her mother decided that for the time being, the Masonic plates would be left in their box and put up in their own attic, and the ultimate decision of what to do with them put off until after the grieving period was well and truly past, and rational thought could replace emotional bereavement. And that's what they did. The dishes, as well as some journals and ropes, were moved up to the attic. It was deep summer, and the air was stifling thick. Miss Dunnig told us that kept her and Brady, her brother, from bothering to go up and peek. Except once. Brady had told her he'd gone up while their parents had gone to the bank, signing more papers about the trust. It took him a minute to find the boxes. They were blended in like they'd always been there. He only managed to find them by looking for the fresh drag marks in the attic's otherwise undisturbed, dusty floor. But find them he did, in the back corner, over what was Miss Dunnig's bedroom. Their parents had placed an old rolled-up oriental rug on top of the boxes. He'd managed to work only one flap free when he heard the old Fairliner's engine coming up the drive, meaning their parents were home. But he was able to see the edge of one of the plates, and that was enough for him to know he'd found them. Other than that one excursion, it was out of sight, out of mind. For a while, anyway. One night, Miss Dunnick woke up, drenched in sweat. They had all the windows open, as a habit to let in the night air, but when she looked over to her window, it was shut. She got up, walked over, and opened it. The air outside was still. She could feel the temperature difference when she stuck her hand out, but it wouldn't come in. It was as if, though, the heat in her room was solid and the night air couldn't mix with it. She looked out. Not a leaf on the trees moved. It was silent, like snowfall, but in August heat shimmers instead of January snowbanks. She thought it was weird, but was still so tired that she decided to turn around and climb back into bed. From behind her, there came a loud bang. She jumped. She thought the window had fallen, but when she turned, it was still open. Another bang, and she realized it wasn't just coming from behind her, but above her. Miss Dunnick ran to her parents' room, knocking loudly and calling out for them until her mother opened the door. She told her mother what she'd heard, but her mother seemed mad, told her it was likely someone had left a window open in the attic and an owl had flown in. Her father would see to it in the morning, but she needed to go back to bed. To Miss Dunnick, that made sense. So she went back to her bedroom and laid down, but she didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, her father went up to the attic to see about freeing whatever owl had gotten itself trapped up there. He came back down. He didn't have an owl, but he did have a foul mood. He called Brady and Miss Dunnick into him and asked which one of them had gone up there. They were both stunned, and both told him they hadn't. He asked if they were sure, and without pause, they said yes. The attic was brutally hot and messy. Brady's curiosity trip from a month ago aside, why would they? Their father seemed uneasy, but told them they were to stay out before going downstairs to speak with their mother. Now, the way Miss Dunnick explained it, their house had a staircase that if you sat far enough down on, you would catch echoes from the kitchen. And as the kitchen was where her parents often had adult-only conversations, the children knew exactly where to sit to overhear why their father was so mad. He told their mother that the old rug was on the floor, but the kids swore it wasn't them, and there weren't any footprints in the dust. Her mother was adamant that when placing the rug onto the boxes, they must have put it too close to the edge, and when the house settled, it fell. Their father seemed to want that to be the answer, but his voice didn't sound convinced. Neither was Miss Dunnick. She had heard 2 bangs. A rug falling would only have explained one. The next few nights, it was quiet. Miss Dunnick did wake up to her room feeling like an oven again, but no sound came from the attic. Given the tenseness and sorrow of her mother having lost her own father, she didn't want to bring up any more problems. She hoped if she ignored it, the problem would go away on its own. It did not. A week or so passed. Miss Dunnick had come down the stairs to get breakfast, hearing the icebox door banging open and closed over and over. She thought maybe her mother was making a big spread, pancakes, ham, all the fixins. But instead, Miss Dunnick found her father. He looked mad, his lip curled up like a dog's as he pulled packages and containers of food out of the refrigerator. Miss Dunnick opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, and her nose and mouth instead filled with an ungodly stench. She looked to the growing pile of food on the kitchen butcher block. She saw that it had all rotted. The eggs were what she described to us. Eggs that her mother had only stocked into the icebox the day before had turned yellow-brown with age and collapsed. They looked like a carton of giant, cavity-filled molars. Miss Dunnick's dad didn't notice her even as her mother brushed past and began to ask him what was wrong. Then she retched loudly, answering the question for him. Miss Dunnick's father slammed the door on the icebox. Her mother offered that maybe it had turned off overnight, but her father wasn't having it. He told her to stick her hand in there, and she would see that it was freezing cold. He asked, "You're telling me it turned itself off for, what, 10 hours? And that somehow all the food rotted in that time? And then, sometime this morning, it just turned itself back on?" But unlike the refrigerator, Miss Dunnick's mother kept her cool. At his outburst, she merely replied, "Or the circuit shorted, which removes any evil planning on behalf of the refrigerator." Miss Dunnick's father began to reply, but finally noticed her and seemed irritated all over. With some stern words, he sent her back upstairs to finish getting ready for school. By the time Miss Dunnick and her brother returned home that afternoon, their mother had gone back out and bought more food. Nobody said anything. The food was put into the same icebox that had been accused of treachery only that morning. But Miss Dunnick did notice both parents eyeing the icebox with new suspicion. Miss Dunnick's brother Brady was the next one to notice something was wrong. He'd gone into her room to borrow a book when a loud bang came from her window. He jumped, turning quickly and seeing it was closed, and assumed the same as Miss Dunnick had herself, that the window had simply fallen shut. But just as he glanced, he saw a bird fly straight into it, smacking against the glass, making the same sound, and falling. He ran from the room and down from the stairs as another bang came from Nora's room. She saw him come barreling past and out the front door. She called after him, but he didn't answer. And when he didn't answer, she followed through the door he'd left behind, wide open. They ran outside, him leading, and around the side of the house, just in time to see another bird fall to the ground before them. They shrieked and scrambled back inside to find their mother and get her to come quick. The sound of yet another bird hitting the window came from behind them. By the time they'd found her and brought her outside, it was over. A pile of birds, crumpled and spotted with blood, lay on the ground. Brady told Miss Dunnick later it looked like what raking leaves in hell must be. Feathers twitching, beaks bubbled with blood. Miss Dunnick looked up from the fake fire. The class was stunned silent. She extended a hand, palm out to us, and as she began again, she counted finger by slender finger. the choking heat in her room, the sound coming from the attic, the rotted food, and now 8 birds all hitting the same window in the same 10 minutes, and then never again. It was too much to be random. Though her mother had been adamant about keeping Grandfather Dunnig's cherished possessions, her birthright, Miss Dunnig thought the uncertainty of the strange plates and weird symbols had been in the back of her mind since she'd found them. Her mother was a proud woman, but even she wanted nothing to do with this legacy. When Miss Dunnig's father came home that evening, her mother was waiting for him at the door. Miss Dunnig surmised she had called him at work and told him her plan, because without a word, he followed her up the stairs to the attic door set into the ceiling, and then up the little fold-out ladder into the attic. 3 boxes were carried out, down the stairs, and to the Ford flare line. Miss Dunnig's mother hesitated only then. Miss Dunnig and her brother Brady were watching from the front room window, feeling both like snoops and yet also entitled to see the final act in the play they'd all been a part of. They watched as their mother leaned forward and gave their father a peck on the cheek. That was something they rarely saw their parents do. Miss Dunnig said this was the worst piece for her because it made the things she thought were childish imagination real enough for adults to worry about. Then she watched her mother duck into the car, bringing it to life with a rumble and disappearing down the drive. Miss Dunnig, Brady, and their father had heated up soup for dinner that night. Her mother didn't come back until almost bedtime. Brady and Miss Dunnig both sat in the echoey part of the stairs to listen in, knowing this was the only way they'd get to hear the rest of the story. Miss Dunnig's mother told their father that she'd been greeted in the lobby by a Mr. Russell. Mr. Russell had given his condolences over the passing of Grandfather Dunnig. His comment was that with such a proper family, it was no doubt that his legacy would live after him. And Mrs. Dunnig's mother replied, "I told him that was precisely what I was afraid of." With their parents' voices getting lower, Brady and Miss Dunnig, fearing they'd come round the corner and discover them, crept back up the stairs to their rooms. Miss Dunnig's mother had leaned out over the window to clean it from the eerie imprints the birds had left, but with a shudder, she pushed the offending pane up. Immediately, she felt the cool night air rush in and felt relief, like she'd been holding her breath ever since the beginning. Miss Dunnig stared into the fake fire, appearing lost in thought. I had questions, so many questions, but I remembered where I was. The other kids seemed shocked into silence. Even Mr. Pruitt stared openly at Miss Dunnig like she'd grown a second head. In the back of the cluster, someone sneezed, and this broke the silence. All at once, Miss Dunnig's face snapped up. She stared right at me with such fierce surprise, I flinched. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat and began telling another story, a funny one about his wife's cooking. I didn't really listen, How could I? Looking back, I was still at that age where I still had that unshakable childlike faith that adults know all that's right and real. And here I had one of those adults tell us, show us, that wasn't so. I could almost picture her mother's face looking in dismay at a pile of dead birds. I never had Miss Dunnig. She transferred away before I got to that grade. But looking back, I think she's the teacher I was closest to. In that moment, in that smelly gym, I remember feeling like she and I were identical in the sudden realization that the world is, outside of regiment and schedule, completely unknowable. We're all standing at a window, opening it and not knowing what's going to happen next. That's today's story. If you liked it, like it with the corresponding button. If you want to subscribe, they've given you a handy button for that as well. And if your response to this story requires a little more creativity, well, the comments are there for you. Until next time, take care, stranger.